I'm Jia. It's really good to see you all here. So I'm the host of the session. And this is the third English session of our international conference on fertility and family. And there are three papers in this session. All of them focus on fertility, but with different perspectives and based on different countries. So for each speaker, you will have 20 minutes to present your study. And the Q&A session will be at the end of the session after all three speakers have completed their presentation. So if for the audience, if you have any question, you may either type your question in the Zoom or you type like, I have a question, and then I can unmute you one by one so that you can ask personally. So let's welcome our first speaker, Paul Bazen.
Thank you very much. I'll try to stick to the 20 minutes timing. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting us to this session, very interesting session. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Yeah. So I hope you can see my screen. Yeah.
Perfect.
Perfect, and you can hear me. So of course, there's been many interesting, excellent contributions to the topic of fertility in China. And for instance, concerning the demographic transition and also many socioeconomic changes and how they have impacted fertility, also family policies and so on. Here, we want to explore a few hypotheses on the effect of education on fertility. And these hypotheses basically derive from more institutional, from the institutional context, from an institutional perspective. And we want to see how this institutional context influence the fertility of different social groups. We focus on contemporary situation, basically the birth cohorts born since the 1980s up to 1990s. So we avoid a bit more troubled period that occurred before this birth cohorts. So this birth cohorts had all of them very low fertility, or low under replacement fertility. We will see that in a minute. And also we control for several potentially confounding effects, including policies, the effect of being in a rural area, and so on. So of course, this is a period since the late 1970s up to now, which is marked by the transition to the market economy, and also decline in state production, and so on. And this had a very important effect in the shift of the cost of children from the collectivity and state to the family. And also this had a very important effect on the educational expansion. So this is in fact the topic that we are going to see. It had a huge effect in the educational attainment of people. In fact, I will jump to the hypothesis because I have several of them. We have several of them. I forgot to say that this is joint work with Van Lee Ni from the University of Louvain. That's very important because it's not only joint work, but also work in progress. So our first hypothesis is about the fact that we expect that irrespective of the educational level of women, all women seek to be at least one child. So permanent infertility will be very low. We know that already, but I think it's important also to see why this can be the case. Although there's been a small increase in this permanent infertility. So it's been, we think that there's a strong interdependence between generations of the life course, and this should be one of the main reasons why all women want to have, or all couples want at least to have one child. Also, there's quite a lot of normative pressures to have at least one child. So we expect that the effect of education on first childbearing is limited to postponement, which is quite the standard hypothesis, at least so the fact that the higher the education, the more the postponement of fertility. But we expect that practically all women have at least one child. A second hypothesis is related to the women's educational attainment, and we expect that this is strongly negative related to the probability of bearing a second or third child. I remember that we are reasoning always controlling for policies and controlling for many other things. So we try to really focus on the effect of educational attainment. So here we have some of the possible arguments can be on three groups. One could be the strong reliance of low educated on child's labor, also on their income, and also on support for old age. Also the fact that the more educated need more educational investments, or in general more investments to increase or maintain their social position, intergenerational position. Also and this is specifically for women, the higher penalization in occupational advancement for better educated women. In fact, if we see these three groups for this hypothesis that the negative relationship between education and second and third births, at least toward the arguments, can also be applied to men. The last one, the higher penalization of occupational advancement for better educated women, this applies essentially to women. So this leads us to propose this third hypothesis, so that male's partner educational attainment has a negative effect on the probability of a second or third birth. So these are essentially men that are already in partnerships, and we try to see whether their effect, their educational effect, is positive or negative. In this case, we think that it's negative. Unlike in many other countries, many other countries, the effect of men tends to be positive, and here we suppose that it will be essentially negative, but less negative than in the case of women. And then we have two hypotheses that are essentially linked to interactions. One is the interaction between education and birth cohorts. So we think that the negative effect of education, that we think is going to be important for second and third births, this is declining over birth cohorts. And the main arguments here that we explain in more detail in the paper are linked to educational stratified diffusion of new fertility norms, and also that the economic and social conditions for all educational groups tend to become more similar over time. For instance, the weakening of interdependence between generations, which is very strong, will be weakening over across cohorts. And also we think that all need increasingly increase the educational investments for educational mobility. So that leads us to think that there will be this decreasing effect of educational level on second births. And our fifth hypothesis is also an interaction. So we think that the negative effect of birth control policies is stronger for the highly educated. And this might be linked, for instance, for the higher resistance to the policy by the low educated. So especially at the beginning in the 1980s, there was quite a lot of resistance, especially in rural areas. In fact, lower educated might have higher economic benefits of several children, and so they have higher incentives to have second and third births, and also potentially they might have the weakest economic control on them, because less often they work on the state sector. They more often live in rural areas and with agricultural income and so on. Also, the political costs of second or third child might be stronger for the highly educated, for instance, for career advancement and also other social reasons. So that's our hypothesis. Here we use data from the China Family Panel studies. This is a study. These are it's a panel that takes place every 2 years, and in fact, the last wave we recently received the last wave, and so yesterday we were making the last few computations, including this last wave. So we have up to 5 waves for each woman, and we also have retrospective data for each woman, and also we have partner data. For example, we have data on the parental household, the mothers and parents' occupation and education and so on, and how this might potentially impact the fertility of women. So we focus on the birth cohorts that are already have already low fertility, so the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s birth cohorts, and we have relatively large samples for each birth. So in principle, we don't have much problems, except in perhaps for third births, which relatively few highly educated women have third birth. So that's the only small problem in that respect. So with respect to the techniques, we use event history models. So for first birth, for second birth, and third birth, we apply standard event history models, but we also want to take into account selection effects. And that leads us to make simultaneous equation modeling, to use simultaneous equation modeling for first, second, and third births, including a heterogeneity component to take into account of the selection effects. So in the paper, we present models which use the standard plane models without using the heterogeneity component, but also models using the heterogeneity component and the simultaneous equation. And also potentially we can have also another source of potential problems or selection, which is the potential endogeneity of education. So might be education for some selection issues might be linked to fertility, potentially negatively linked to fertility. So that's why we use also an equation in some models that takes into account the progression in educational attainment of the women. And this is a sequential probit model. So here I will present the models with the more complex specification, but in fact, even with more simpler specification, the main hypothesis and the main conclusions hold, and substantially the results that I'm going to present are the same, whatever the specification that we use. In fact, here, just to show that there is the case that there is some, these error terms are significant. So the standard deviation of these error terms are significant, and also the correlation is significant. So there are some selection effects and endogeneity effects going on. So potentially it is useful to include them. But first, very quickly to start with some survival functions, some descriptive results. Here we have that this is for first birth. We see that there has been some postponement in fertility in the first birth. We see that practically all women have a first birth, that permanent infertility is very small. It has been some increase, and this is being related to essentially to postponement to educational level of the women. We see that there is strong postponement which can be expected for highly educated women. And also there is slightly higher infertility, permanent infertility for highly educated women. But essentially all women have a first child, which go in the same direction of our first hypothesis. The situation is very different for second births. For second births, we see there is a huge educational stratification. We see that really the better educated women, the vast majority of them do not have a second child, while for the low educated women, the majority of them do have a second child. So there is a huge variation according to education, a huge stratification according to education. But the levels, if we compare the levels for the different birth courses, there's relatively little differences. A slight increase in second birth for the more recent birth cohort. And for the third birth, we see that few women have third births. Very really few women. And again, this is hugely educationally stratified. Again, the few, really, very few women with higher education have a third birth. And in fact, proportionally, the differentials are even higher, but of course, really is relatively few women have a third birth. And this is valid for the 3 birth cohorts that we have. So if we go to the multivariate results, here we present the relative risk for first, second, and third birth. We see there is a strong, in fact, in the case of first birth, this is essentially a strong postponement. This reflects essentially a strong postponement, which we expected. But for second and third births, this strong stratification, the negative effect of education, is essentially a probability effect. So fewer women are having a second and third births for highly educated women. We also included the policy effect. So of course, the women who are not allowed by the policy to have a child, this reduces strongly their probability of having a second birth. We are working on the third birth and trying to have also an indicator for policy for third birth, but this is a relatively complicated indicator in the sense that this is an indicator for each woman, specific to each woman and for each period of time. Since the situation for each woman changes because it takes into account also the partner, the fact that how many siblings the woman has, and so on. So it's a relatively complicated indicator of policy, or whether the women are allowed by the policy to have a second birth and also third birth. But in this case, we are working on this indicator for third birth. Of course, it has a strong negative effect, this policy indicator. So we also had a hypothesis about partner education, and we were thinking that essentially will have a negative effect. So similarly to women, but not so strong, not as strong as for women. And indeed, it is the case for second births. It does have quite a strong effect, the negative effect of the education of the male partner. This is for women in a partnership, has quite a strong negative effect on second births. But on third births, this is not the case. And we don't have clear explanation for that. We expected that it should have a strong, also negative effect, but even including considering selection effects, we don't find this significant negative effect of education on third births in the case of men. And also, we had a hypothesis in which we thought that there should be a declining effect of education over birth cohorts. So we expect that should be a declining effect of women's education on birth or on the fertility according to education. But perhaps,
1 more minute.
Yeah, but, this is the model how we combine different birth cohorts and women's education. Perhaps it's easier to see the results in this way. So we see that so our hypothesis tells, okay, it should be a declining effect. So it declining differentials in the educational impact, in the impact of education. And indeed, you see that for tertiary educated, practically nobody in the older birth cohort, 1960s, had a third birth. But this, the differential between women with low educated and high educated declines, becomes narrower. So in that sense, our hypothesis will be supported by this data. And the last hypothesis was about the policies. And we thought that the policies should have a stronger effect on the better educated and little effect or smaller effect on the low educated. And indeed, this is what we find. In fact, for the less than primary, we were surprised that it practically has no effect or no significant effect. So the fact of not being allowed to have a second child, this is for second births, practically has no effect for so the policy didn't have, according to this data and according to this analysis, practically had no effect on the low educated, but it had a strong effect on the high educated. So you see this differential effect of the policy according to the women's level of education. And
time to wrap up.
And I go to the conclusions. These results essentially give support to our hypothesis, which was very explorative at the beginning, but essentially for the second birth. For the third birth, is much less the case. Our hypotheses are essentially derived from this institutional context, and we try to see how this institutional context translates into different stratification in terms of educational impacts on fertility. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Let's welcome our second speaker, Pavlos, and he will give a talk about the fertility, childlessness, and family size in Greece.
Hello, I will share my screen. Did you see my screen or not?
Yep.
Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, because, okay. Now it's in the beginning because I don't see my screen. Okay. Okay. Hello. My name is Pavlos Baltas. I firstly want to thank very much the chair and the members of the scientific panel on family behavior in East Asia and Southern Europe for accepting and allowing me to present my work during the conference. I am a researcher in the field of human geography and demographic analysis at the Social Research Institute of the Greek National Center for Social Research here in Greece. And today, my today's presentation is Fertility, Childlessness, and Family Size in Greece, a cohort perspective. Okay. The objective of this work is to examine the unfolding of cohort fertility in Greece by presenting the evolution of specific indicators over the generations, and specifically for women born from 1920 to 1970. We examine the decline of cohort fertility in the younger generation and the emerging phenomena like childlessness and change in family size. In the first part of my presentation, we look at the total fertility rate without any distinction. And in the second part, we look at the cohort fertility rate concerning the marital status and the educational status. We will examine these indicators in the lens of the marital status and the education status of the woman. Concerning the data, we retrieved the data from the last Greek census, which was in 2011. And specifically, there was a question about the number of the live births a woman gave during her life. And this question addressed it to every woman that was over 10 years old, the day of the census. Based on this, on the response of this question, we calculate some specific indicators, which are the complete or its cohort fertility rate, children per woman, the cohort fertility distribution according to the number of the children, and the parity progression ratios. We have done all these calculations for the total woman, but also, as I said, by marital status and education level. So let's just jump in the results of these calculations. So here we see the the evolution of the cohort fertility from generation 1920, from birth cohort 1920 to birth cohort 1970. As we can see, the total cohort fertility rate after a first period from birth cohort 1920 to 1930, where cohort fertility drops are from around 2.5 children to 2 children per woman. There is a stable period of almost 25 generations, during 25 generations, where cohort fertility from generation birth cohort 1930 to 1955 stays stable around 2 children per woman. After that period, it starts a decline of cohort fertility, and every younger generation, the cohort fertility for every younger generation is lower. Here is a cohort fertility distribution. This is the percent of the children and the repartition of women according to the percent, the number of the children they had. So here we according concerning the fertility distribution, we can conclude that the family size reduced over the generation. We see that the two-child family became the norm. As we can see, women with 4 or 5 or plus children, the percent of women with 4 or 5 children or plus decreased during from the older to the younger generations, and we see that the percent of women with 2 children increased until the birth cohort of 1960. After the birth cohort 1960, we can see that there is a decline of a percent of women with 2 children, because we have an increase of 1 children families and the increase of childless women. Let's see. Okay. So I go to this is also, we can see this in the parity progression ratios. We see that the probability of a woman to have a third or a fourth or a fourth or a fifth child, if she has a second, fourth, or a third or a fourth, is decreasing during all this period. For example, for a woman who born in the 1930, there's 40%. If she had a second child, to have a third child, but in the generation of 1965, this is only 30%. No, so it's it decreased. Yes. Okay. This is also the case of women after the 60s. We see that we have after the year which were born in the 1960, that there is a decrease also in the parity progression ratios for a woman to have which have one child to have a second, and for women who has no child to have one child. This is also due to the increase of childness, as we saw in the previous figure. Now, if we compare the fertility, what happens if we examine this? If we examine the same indicators by marital status, in figures 4 shows the cohort fertility according to marital status for the same birth cohorts. We can see that for the marital status is defined as for single woman, for married woman, for divorced woman, and for widow. And we see that cohort fertility for married woman, or for married and widow woman, is stays all the examining period is over 2 child per woman. So there's no yes, it's all the examining period is over 2 child per woman. And we can, the most important thing which shows this this figure is that the fertility out of wedlock in Greece is minimal. It's almost the same for all examining generations. It's around 0.2 children per woman, and for divorced woman also is less than the married and widow woman. But the most important is that childbearing out of marriage is minimal in Greece, in all these cohorts. So comparing now, in this figure, you can see the single woman childlessness rate, no matter the birth cohort, is around 90%. That means if you are a single woman in Greece, if you were a single woman in Greece in these birth cohorts, 9 out of 10 have no children. So it's a very on the other hand, for married women, you can see that the same for the same indicators, childlessness, it's around for the younger generation around 5%. So we can have a first remark that the decline of the fertility that we saw in the first figure is according not that the married or widow woman have less children. There is no decline in cohort fertility for the married woman, but is due to that the share of divorced and single woman is increasing in in the younger cohorts. You can see that the share of single woman until the birth cohort of 1950 was around 5%, and we see that it is doubled for 1968 cohort, and it goes more for the younger cohort. The same for the divorced woman. So as we can remark that the increase of the share of the single divorced woman in the cohorts as the births out of marriage are minimal in Greece is a first point why the cohort fertility in Greece declined. Now, concerning the education level, we divided the education level into 3 categories: low, medium, and high. Low educational level includes categories 0, 1, and 2 from the International Standard Classification of Education. The medium category includes categories 3, 4, and 5 from the same classification. That means that the high level educational category, we included the there are here in this category, there are a woman who has upper secondary education, I think to college. And in the third category, high education category, we included the categories 6, 7, and 8. There is a mistake in the slide. 4 is 6, 6 to 8. And we include 6 to 8. That means that in the high level education category, we mean woman who has a bachelor or a master or a PhD. We see here also that from the data from the census that fertility for women with low education is above 2 child per woman for all the examining period. And we see that as the level of education increase, the fertility decrease. And we see here that for the birth cohort, for the women with medium education, after the birth cohort of 50s, cohort fertility is around 1.8 children per woman. And for women with at least a bachelor or a master or a PhD, fertility is around 1.5 children per woman, and it is declining for the younger cohort. So, concerning childlessness, we see that the woman with higher education have higher childlessness level above 15% for all birth cohorts. At the same time, the childlessness for women with a lower education level, it's about around 10%. We have the same thing here, that during all this, there is an increase in education level from older to younger cohorts. You can see that for women which were born in 1920, between 1920 and 1930, the 90% of women has a low education level. And it was very difficult for this generation, because these women start their reproduction year between 1935 and 1945. So this means that it was between Second World War and after 1945 to 1949 in Greece, there was also a civil war. So it was difficult years for these women. And we see that we see that the education level it increased from the older to the younger generation. So as the education level increase, it's normal that the cohort fertility decline. Now, some remarks. As I said, the cohort fertility decline. Childness is increasing. We saw today two different aspects why it is declining, but there are more, I think so, and we have to combine all this. Okay, we see the critical role of marriage in childbearing in Greece. It's true that if you see the statistics, today with the percent of births out of marriage in Greece, it stays around 11%. This is data 2018. So it's I think it's the lower. I'm sure it's the lower between the European Union members, and I am not. Maybe it's the lower in Europe. 11% of births out of marriage. Family of two child is a norm, but as we've seen, there is a decline in the younger generations in favor for the one child family. Future steps, as we know, national averages often cover up spatial variation. So we're also working on to see the spatial variations of cohort fertility, because here is a GIF with the evolution of cohort fertility by region, Greek region, and we can see that in the metropolitan areas, like here in Athens and here where is Thessaloniki, the big cities, the fertility goes under 2 child per woman from the generation of from birth cohort 1930. Thank you for your attention. I hope my accent was not so bad, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pavlos. I think we can all understand, and your talk is wonderful. Let's welcome our third and last speaker, Momoko, who will have a study on fertility differences between Spain and Sweden.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, 1 sec. Okay, can everyone see it?
Yep.
Okay. So hi, my name is Momoko Nishikiro, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona, Spain. And this work in progress was done by myself and my colleague Chi Tsui and my supervisors Albert Esteve, Mariona Lozano, and Dietrich Borten, called Explaining Fertility Differentials Between Spain and Sweden by Partnership Status. Okay, so first I just wanted to clarify why Spain and Sweden. And in fertility literature, these two countries are often placed as polar opposites, with Spain as a Southern European country having lowest low levels of fertility, and Sweden as a Nordic or Northern European country having highest low levels of fertility. But like you see here, but also mostly here, there are more ways that they differ. This is just a short list of differences that are important to our study, and they're categorized under strong family ties, which is often associated with Spain, and weak family ties associated with Sweden. And now moving on to a more general introduction on low fertility in Europe. So we've been seeing a practically universal trend in declining fertility. And in Europe, this gained more prominence around the 1960s and 70s. But even among low fertility countries, heterogeneity is noticeable. Like I said, with the highest low for Sweden and the lowest low for Spain. Sometimes they just say very low or ultra low, and they each have a different threshold of TFR, all below subreplacement level. And together with these advanced societies experiencing low levels of fertility, these societies also observe the postponement of individual transitions to adulthood. And so one study framed the modern pathways to adulthood, its timing and sequencing as being something that's late, protracted, and complex, particularly the postponing of union formation, entry into marriage, and entry into parenthood. Okay, and while developed countries remain having these heterogeneous levels of low fertility, in Europe, the average desired number of children per woman has been stable around 2. And furthermore, a recent study found that the majority of late births are now concentrated in first and second births, whereas previously in the 1950s or so, we saw a concentration more on higher order births. So this implies that more women have had to forego childbearing during their prime reproductive ages and for whatever reason. And they try to now have a first child past the age of 40. And there have been rising levels of late first births, particularly in countries such as Italy, Spain, and also Japan, all with high levels of childlessness, low levels of TFR, and all known for having more family-oriented traditions and norms. So why are some countries closer to this desired level of children than others? One of the million-dollar questions of demography. And comparative research on fertility differentials within low fertility countries have focused on several factors. For example, cultural or institutional differences across countries. Some countries, such as Southern European countries, are more family-oriented with stronger family ties, as I mentioned, and the Nordic countries are more individualistic, egalitarian, with weaker family ties. And the latter countries also have more generous institutions and gender equal policies, or policies that try and help the independence of youth. And these kind of policies have been thought to stimulate fertility. Another, of course, being stages of ideological change, the famous second demographic transition, suggesting that the emergence of low fertility and diversity of family types were primarily driven by this ideological shift towards emphasizing individualism and self-actualization. So this implies that different fertility levels are the outcome of different stages of this ideological change across countries. However, there has been some kind of pushback towards this theory. And one of the reasons is it kind of suggests a unilinear developmental path where there's an end stage, and the end stage is that the countries all look kind of like an advanced Western society. And also, this SDT also placed a lot of emphasis on ideological change, more like only, and whereas all unforeseen change has taken place. For example, globalization, increase in economic uncertainty, coronavirus. And so research maybe perhaps should shift to focusing on the interaction of multiple factors. In addition, the time in which the second demographic transition was written by Van de Kamp-Lestagen around the late 1980s, placing this in the context of the period TFR of Spain and Sweden, we observed that Spain and Sweden were in opposite positions than they are now, where Spain has the higher fertility during this time, though it is declining. So this is kind of the context which they refer to. And also another explanation has been the study by Mirskala and others on economic human development. And this argues that fertility reversals are likely to occur among low fertility countries with higher levels of socioeconomic development. And also a lot of theories have related the differences in fertility to the extent of gender equality within countries, saying that more gender equal societies, such as the Nordic countries, would observe higher levels of fertility relative to countries that are less gender equal. And however, we see that very gender equal and economically advanced societies, such as the Nordic countries, here we see Sweden, have been experiencing declining fertility levels, and advanced societies with increasing gender equality, such as Spain, still experience very low levels of fertility. And these theories were based in a time where period fertility levels were increasing, which was during the turn of the century. And now, as I mentioned, we see a decline. Moreover, an abundance of work has been done also focusing on the fertility of couples that have already been formed and within couple dynamics, which may deter childbearing or enhance childbearing. So what we wanted to do was take a step back from this and consider important events that occur prior to parenthood, such as stable partnership formation, which can be considered a precondition to parenthood. So maybe this already is an obstacle that comes between an individual and first birth. And despite the crass national differences in fertility levels and many other factors, as I have just discussed, if forming a stable partnership is an obstacle, this is an issue for fertility rates because we know that a majority of births tend to occur within a marriage or consensual union. And a lack of stable partner is the most frequently reported reason for unfulfilled childbearing desires in Europe. So this leads us to our research aim, which is to investigate the importance of partnership status in explaining fertility differentials between Spain and Sweden. And to do this, we take two approaches, both based on descriptive work. We first calculate and compare first birth probabilities between Spanish and Swedish women. And we also perform a separate decomposition to quantify the impact of partnership status on the fertility differential between the two countries. And now to some background. Here we see the percent of ever parents. And we see that by the age of 35, there are drastic differences in parenthood between these two countries, around 20 percentage points or so, with Swedish women having a larger share of women having had a child relative to their Spanish counterparts. And regarding the timing and sequencing of first birth, which is the orange, we see that the majority of Swedish women experience entering parenthood earlier than their Spanish counterparts based on these median ages that we see now in the figure. And in terms of percentage of those that have ever been in a stable partnership, which we define in our study as a co-residential partnership, regardless of it being marital or non-marital, we observe already noticeable differences between the two countries by age 20. And then by age 25, we see that a majority of Swedish women have been in a co-residential or stable partnership, whereas this occurs for Spanish women by the age of 30. And by the age of 35, we see a catch-up of Spanish women, but Swedish women still have a higher share of women who have ever been in a stable partnership. And then we go on to update the previous figure on the timing and intensity of these adulthood transition events and see a much younger median age in which Swedish women encounter their first stable partnership compared to Spanish women. So it's as if when the majority of Spanish women have been in a stable partnership, close to a majority of Swedish women have already encountered parenthood. Okay, and in terms of data, we take advantage of the Harmonized Histories dataset, and we focus on Spain and Sweden. This data contains retrospective information, which we are able to then use to reconstruct partnership histories. Our sample contains native-born Spanish and Swedish women from the following cohorts and during these ages. We also look only at biological births. Here, I've kind of differentiated between the sample that we're using for the probabilities and the decomposition, though they're from the same sample or the same surveys. And a brief note on the data limitations. Basically, it's that we have a smaller sample size for Sweden, and so we're more confident in what we see with the Spanish case than for the Swedish case. And furthermore, because the Swedish survey is conducted earlier than the Spanish survey, there are less Swedish women that reach the age of 45. And so that's just what I highlighted in blue here. Okay, so with this data, we calculate the probabilities of having a first birth within the next 3 years by partnership status at a given age. So what we do is we compare the probability of having a first child within the next 3 years between for example, a 25-year-old Swedish woman in a stable partnership and her 25-year-old Spanish counterpart. And we also do the same comparison of the probability of first birth within the next 3 years. For example, of a 25-year-old Swedish woman without a stable partner with her Spanish counterpart. And we thought that maybe accounting for partnership status in this way would show some interesting results. So this is the first result for the probabilities. And just a note that I use the 1965 and 1969 cohort as our example throughout, as it's the cohort with the most observations of women who have completed their reproductive age. And so here we find two things. Firstly, this shows that having a partner is important in entering parenthood, and that having a stable partner suggests a much higher probability to have a child within the next 3 years, relative to those that do not have a stable partner, which is on the dotted line. And secondly, Swedish women have a higher probability of having a first birth within the next 3 years relative to their Spanish counterparts at practically all ages. Also, this result shows that having a stable partner at the right time is crucial. So relative to having a stable partner too early or too late, it seems here in the figure, at least, that having a partner in the mid to late 20s shows the highest probability of entering parenthood for the case of Spain and Sweden. So I guess we find three things. Okay, but with these probabilities, we still don't know the final implications of partnership on fertility differentials between the two countries. So we chose to decompose this and confirm the importance of stable partnership formation in childbearing behaviors. And we use the Kitagawa decomposition method. Another note that the approaches which follow are not based on the first childbearing within the next 3 years, but are just based on the current first childbirth. Okay. So what the Kitagawa decomposition did was basically it quantifies the absolute difference in first birth rates between Spain and Sweden, and it attributes this difference into two components, the rate effect and the compositional effect, where the rate effect captures the impact of the difference in age-specific first birth rates by partnership between Sweden and Spain on the difference in their first birth rates, and compositional effect captures the impact of the difference in partnership composition between Sweden and Spain on the difference in their first birth rates. It's a mouthful. I wrote it down here so you guys can see it more clearly. So these are the results for the decomposition. Firstly, the highlighted, which is the Swedish first birth rate minus the Spanish first birth rate. And so we're trying to decompose the difference that you see, 0.169, into the rate and compositional effect. And the results show that the compositional effect of stable partnership status plays a significant role, particularly from the ages 20 to 29, and in favor of a higher Swedish fertility. By controlling for partnership composition, we observe that Spanish women have a higher fertility after the age of 30. And this suggests also that the Spanish women enter parenthood later compared to Swedish women. Now, overall, we find that the compositional effect explains a large share of the first birth differentials between Sweden and Spain. Lastly, we standardize the Spanish first birth rate by giving Spain the partnership composition of Sweden. And doing this resulted in an increase of 0.205 in first birth rate among Spanish women to a first birth rate of 0.913 from the previous 0.708. So this is higher than the previous first birth rate of the Spanish, but this is also higher than the Swedish first birth rate because, one, the difference in age-specific first birth rates by partnership status between Sweden and Spain were minimal and actually slightly in favor of Spain having a higher rate. And two, by giving the partnership composition of Sweden to Spain and keeping Spain's age-specific fertility, age-specific first birth rates, the increase in the share of partnered Spanish women then increases the standardized Spanish first birth rate to surpass that of the Swedish. Okay, so in conclusion, our findings suggest that stable partnership formation is an important factor for entering parenthood, especially having a stable partner during reproductive ages. And focusing on stable partnership formation as a condition to entering parenthood appears to provide a different and meaningful perspective to consider in future research when explaining cross-national fertility differences. And differences in partnership composition appears to largely explain first birth differentials between Spain and Sweden, meaning our findings suggest that the formation of more stable partnerships in Spain would likely facilitate higher first birth rates, which we saw in our example with the standardized TFR. And lastly, more attention then maybe should be placed in literature to obstacles individuals may face in forming these necessary stable partnerships, because our findings have kind of suggested that partnership formation is important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot by keeping time. So let's open to the Q&A session. I saw some of the questions have already been answered with text by those presenters, but still we have some questions. One is from, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Are you still here? I will just allow you to talk. Abihiman.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name correctly.
No problem. Thank you. I would just like to ask, in the first presentation, what was the impact of education on whether to have a child in the first place? Because if I understand correctly, it was kind of a comparison between first, second, and third child or the birth, but the extensive margin, what is the impact of education in the extensive margin? Thank you.
So I guess it's a question for our paper. Yes. For the paper on China.
Yes, that's right.
So basically, what we found is that for first birth, the educational differentials were very, very small. So basically, everybody or all women had a first birth. We didn't explore the case of men. In the case of men, it's likely that for the most recent birth cohort, it is possible that there are more men with are childless. But here, few women are childless, less than 10%, although there is a small increase, and this increase is related to education. But if we compare the very strong effect of education on second and third births, the small differentials, there is a very small differentials in first birth. So our interpretation, or in fact, our hypothesis was that the reason for that, everybody kind of needs a first birth. That would be the hypothesis. And the reason is that we think that there is a strong interdependence between generations. And this is not only for rural or agricultural persons, people who work in agriculture, in which the family is the unit of production, but also for people in urban areas, in all types of occupations. So there is a strong interrelationship between generations, not in all age, certainly, but also during the whole life course. For instance, there is a lot of care given by the older generation to the younger generation. Also, if we think about the fate in economic terms of the older generation, is also linked to the younger generation, to the extent that, okay, there is a strong intergenerational mobility, so it's likely that the children are going to have much better economic situation. So this is also provides incentives to be linked to the younger generation. So here we have, okay, very relatively weak welfare state that doesn't provide all age pensions and many other services, and this has to be done inside the family. And of course, there is also a lot of cultural continuities in terms of norms, patriarchal family norms, and perpetuation of family lines, and so on. So there are these two big types of potential explanations for this need to have at least one child.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question is by Laurie, and Laurie, you can talk now. Laurie, you can just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering basically about the endogeneity of partnership formation and childbirth, and whether the decomposition, well, I think I've already said it, that I'm wondering if people form partnerships because they want children.
Hi, Laurie. Thanks for the question. It's a super good question. I was just actually typing to you the answer, like what I would think. But I didn't consider that in the analysis. So I think I would look into it, but I don't know if maybe Albert has a better answer than me. I would greatly appreciate.
I also agree that this is a very good question. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools to examine whether, I guess, with the surveys that we're working with, probably we don't have the best data to test this hypothesis. But it's of course very, very important. Momoko didn't show the results of living parental home, but it's also extremely different. So in Sweden, right, yeah, 90% of 20 years old are already living out of the parental home. And in Spain, it's only 10% at age 20, maybe. No? So that also, it's an important dimension for being able to form a partner and so on. But probably it's also true that that there is a little bit of endogeneity here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question for selfish reasons? Am I still audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of your study, the reason endogeneity would matter would be that it would affect how successful promoting partnership would be at promoting fertility. But I'm also using the harmonized histories just to look at stability in kids' lives. And you're assuming that co-residential partnerships are stable, which is fine. It's a great proxy. But one of the things that I'm highlighting is that people who've made a purposive decision to marry are very different than people who have had a child together, because one can happen by accident and the other one can't. So I'm kind of wondering whether it's possible to use, I want your opinion on the methodological option of using the harmonized histories to go back, say, 3 years before childbirth and say, okay, people that have been partnered for at least 3 years have a stable partnership, not just a co-residential partnership. Let's look at the stability of kids' lives if they're born to partnerships that were already in place well before they were conceived.
No, this is doable. With a new survey in Spain, this is possible, and I guess we also contributed to put this data into the harmonized histories of GGS, Rio. So you'll be able to do that. That's something we can do. Yeah.
Does it make sense to you methodologically?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah, because it makes sense to, yeah. No, I think it makes perfect sense. In our approach, we only consider being in union at a certain point of time, but we can add some duration of these unions, no? and see whether this makes a difference as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just mounting the learning curve with the harmonized histories, so I'm on my way, but not there.
Yeah.
Me too.
Okay.
Lori, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just going to say to Lori, if I can jump in here, since there wasn't another question in the queue. We've done some work with this, and the harmonized histories and the GGS in general are great for this. You know, you can basically, make child records that trace their entire lives with respect to the nature of their mother's union status. So that would be something that would be really quite straightforward to do. And I think the idea is great because there is huge heterogeneity, as you might imagine, in the stability of parental unions from the perspective of children, with the US being a massive outlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you've emboldened me to ask my other totally selfish question. So I started this project working with a co-author who's doing the analysis with the harmonized history data, and he's reticent to share his code with me, but I want to push the analysis further, and he's busy. So is there anyone who's already created child files that would be willing to share code with me for making child files instead of parent files out of the harmonized histories?
I'd have to check. Yeah, I didn't do the work, but this was graduate students who have long since gone on to other things, but I can look into it.
Thank you, Jim.
Of course.
So Yuxie want to have some comments as well as asking questions.
Yeah, I have a question for the Greece paper, actually for all authors, researchers in Europe. In the US, at least, religion plays a role on fertility, but religion, unfortunately, is not allowed for government statistics. But we know from private or university surveys, both on family behaviors and fertility, religion plays a role. I worked with Alan Thornton on that. I just want to know how much importance there is for religion to affect the fertility and family behavior in general. Is that still, I know in some countries it's pretty much over, it's completely secular, but is that true for whole Europe or for Greece and some other countries? Is religion an important factor, still a factor? I didn't see that in your paper, just wondered. What's the role of religion in Europe nowadays?
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yes, you are very right what you are saying. Religion plays a role, but we don't have data. We don't have data about, there are no surveys on the religion and fertility here in Greece. But I think what plays a role is, I don't think if it's religion or tradition. I think that something that I cannot prove because I don't have the data is that the shotgun marriage, the percent of shotgun marriage, it increased. What we are doing here in Greece, when a woman that in a relation is pregnant, we are going and we have a marriage. Is this understand? There are, I think that there is an increase of shotgun marriage. So to keep the tradition, when we have a pregnancy, we get married. This is, I think, the case. But I don't have the data to prove that, because I don't have data. But you are very right that tradition and religion plays a big role, because I think that the conceptions are out of marriage, but the birth is inside the marriage. But I don't have the data to say that. But I think that's the case. Conception after marriage and the birth of the child inside the marriage.
Anyone else could give an update on religion?
If I can add something. Well, yesterday, Ron Lestager introduced, he highlighted the role of religion in explaining, for instance, the difference in fertility and I think other issues about cohabitation. Yes, it was about cohabitation between Italy and Spain. And I think he was right that Spain is very secularized society, and it was secularized very, very early. In fact, much earlier than probably the 60s or something like that, but also Italy. And I think other issues also matter. And in the case, for instance, of Italy and Spain, when I was hearing him, I was also thinking, okay, but there are many other things that are different. For instance, the educational expansion was much stronger in Spain, especially for highly educated women, much stronger in Spain than in Italy. Also, the proportion of women who are in the labor market, which is of course related to education, was much stronger in Spain. And this was related to several issues, like educational policies changed already in the 1970s, much more comprehensive system. Also, the labor market changed quite substantially already in the 1980s, much stronger liberalization. So sometimes we try to, okay, this is religion. Well, might be. And I think it matters, secularization, but perhaps we shouldn't jump too quickly to conclusions, because there are also other things that happen at the same time in this case, in the comparison between Italy and Spain. Many other issues were different and are different in between these two societies. And we cannot say, okay, this is Spain is secularized and Italy is not secularized. Yes, there is a difference, but we can go and see many other differences between these two countries, and probably also with Greece and other, Portugal also is very interesting contrast, and so on. So we cannot perhaps attribute to religion too quickly and too strong influence, when there are many other topics that potentially are likely to have influenced these relationships, including cohabitation and low fertility. That's, I don't know if somebody else.
I don't know if I can add, if there is time, I can add something.
Go ahead.
The new Spanish fertility survey has a question on religion, so we can do some estimates. I would agree with Pau Baizan that at the macro level, probably Spain is not longer a religious country, so I wouldn't use this explanation to explain what has happened in Spain. But at the micro level, if you run a logistic regression, I can share the screen because we have the results already, but it has a positive effect. So basically, people with Muslim religion in Spain have higher odds of having babies than people with no religion. Also, Catholics and Protestants have also higher rates. So it matters, at the individual level, that those who say that they follow, Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, they have higher probabilities of having more children and earlier than those who declare that they don't have religion. But that would work probably at the micro level. But to explain overall trends, I would not use a lot this explanation.
I'm not reaching any conclusions because I haven't done much. But I was contrasting America, US to Europe. It's a continent size comparison, continent comparison. I think in terms of composition, I think the US might be more religious than Europe overall. And then religion also plays a bigger role as a factor affecting fertility. You have Mormons, you have Catholics, and you have fundamental Protestants in the South. and they produce a lot of children in the long tail. You have 5, 6, 8 children. You don't see in Europe at all. So I'm just proposing this as a possibility of explanation for why U.S. is very quite different. We also have immigration, but we do. But many immigrant groups, Chinese actually have low fertility, but Mexicans do have high fertility. But also it's more Catholic culture, Catholic religion. So I'm just proposing this. If you compare Europe as new continent or new Europe versus old Europe, I think religion may explain, contribute to the differences of Europe being low fertility and U.S. is not low fertility, is a replacement low fertility. As an explanation, I just want to have your feel to the hypothesis. This is I haven't done the research, but this has always been on my mind.
And in countries like, well, in general in Europe, but especially in countries like Spain, you will find that a majority of people, something like 3/4 of the population, says, yes, I am a Catholic or I am a believer. But in terms of actual behavior, they are not really practicing their religion. They are essentially very similar to people who have no religion in that respect. So that in general, the society is not organized according to religion group, except for some minorities. And in some these minorities, yes, in this case, of course, these minorities, evangelicals or other groups, Muslims and so on, this might have a much higher fertility, but it's because of their isolation from the rest of society. But I would say 90% of the society in countries like Spain, even if they people say, yes, I am a Catholic, in practice, they are not very different from people who are not Catholic or has no religion. This really doesn't make a big difference in general.
Good.
I agree that in Greece is the same thing as Pau said, that many people may say that they are religious, the majority, but in practice, I don't think that they practice their religion in a regular way. But we see that in births out of marriage. There they are keeping the tradition to, if there is a conception out of marriage, to have a shotgun marriage in order to the birth be in the marriage. So I agree with Paul. Sorry.
I have another hypothesis. We don't have anyone from Israel. I think if you look at Israel, probably religion, both Jews and Muslims, religion plays a bigger role as in the US. So I'm really thinking of the upper tail, because in the US, you do have 5, 6, 7, 8 children, those long tail. You don't see those in China, East Asia. You don't see those in Europe, but those are now driven mostly by religious people groups. You have this kind of long tail. You will see that in Israel. You see that in America, 5, 6, 8 children. There's a long tail, Catholics and Jews and Muslims and also Mormons. Those kind of religious, like behaving in religious beliefs, you don't see those in Europe. But anyway, I've said enough.
Okay, Jim also have a question.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jia. I wanted to follow up, Pavlos, on your response to Yushia's question. And you mentioned something about shotgun marriages and the like. And I just want to give a little background. You know, this working group was generated by a shared desire to really understand similarities and differences between fertility and family in East Asia and Southern Europe. And I think we've learned a lot about Spain and Italy. I'm always disappointed to not find enough information about Greece and Portugal and other low fertility Southern European countries. But I'm asking this because one of the real striking differences between the two areas, the two regions, is non-marital fertility. And I think you really emphasized the point that non-marital fertility is very low in Greece. But I would argue from the perspective of a researcher of East Asia that 10% is quite high, actually, and perhaps surprisingly high. And I'd like to ask if you could just share a little bit of information about the characteristics of women who have children outside of marriage. I think the trend was pretty flat, but anything you can share to shed light on the nature of that transition and the likelihood that that may increase in time, like it has in Italy and Spain dramatically, I'd really like to hear. So thanks.
I'm sorry, but I will disappoint you, because
Okay. I had to ask.
I haven't done the analysis of the this is a future step. You are right to have the analysis of the woman who have a child out of marriage, but I haven't done the analysis, so I don't have many. I think so. Something that an hypothesis that we are doing is that the increase of the births after marriage, the last 10-15 years increase, because it was around 7%, 5%, is in younger ages due to immigration. In younger ages due to immigration, because there was a big wave of immigrants during the 90s in Greece from the Balkans countries, and in the older ages with high educated women. But this is an hypothesis that we are searching to find. But this is that it concerns immigrant women in younger ages that they don't have the means to do an abortion and all this, and women in the ages of 40s, that the high educated women that they want a child and they have the power to have the child after marriage. To I don't know if you understand that. That's the two hypotheses that we're making, but I don't have the data to show you this.
Okay. Well, when you do have an opportunity, know that there's one person who would really like to see
okay,
it. So please
I will
share.
send you an email.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So any other questions? And you may raise your hand. I'll just type something in the Q&A box.
I see a hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you can talk.
Yesego, Bodigo.
Yeah, Isiko, you can talk now. You can just.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Lesotho Budhalo. I'm from South Africa. I've got the question for the last paper on partnership, and that's linking partnership to the probability of having a child in the next 3 years. My question is, or my comment is, what if the length of partnership might have shown a different picture, because partnership can differ in length. For example, for those partners who have been in partnership for 5 years can think of having a child in the next 3 years. But those who have only been in the partnership for 2 years or 1 year cannot even think about having a child. So I'm asking my colleague there how she has unpacked or packed this partnership. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So you're right that we didn't kind of differentiate between the length of the partnership. We just kind of assumed that it's stable if they are co-residing together. And so you asked if they would make a difference if we did control for the length?
Yes. Yes, that's my main question, exactly.
Yeah. Well, we do it within the next 3 years because we are kind of also assuming that the partnership would be stable, that then they could kind of not anticipate, but then they have some time then to have that child within the next 3 years. I don't know. We didn't differentiate, but I don't know if it would make a difference. That's a good point, actually. Maybe it's something to try to just run a kind of robustness.
But this is the question raised the possibility that some people form partnerships in order to have children. Some people form partnerships for companionship without children. So it might be partnership might be endogenous to intention to have children. I know that's true in China. Marriage was just for many people is just for having children. So so it's hard to separate. It's not a condition, but it's actually endogenous to having child.
Right. Yeah, and I think this was also brought up before with the endogeneity. So I think it's something we have to kind of consider.
But I would like to add here that Spain and Sweden, they don't have that different intentions to have children. So I think if you look at the statistics, it's this desired family size of 2 children per woman is kind of universal in Europe. And I would doubt that there are strong difference between Spain and Sweden. Probably they want to have them earlier, maybe in Sweden. That would be an indigeneity problem as well. But yesterday in our closed meeting, no, like 2 days ago, we saw that Spanish women and Spanish men, they really want to have children. The problem is that they don't have the means, and many of them, they say, the reason why I've not been able to accomplish my desired family size, it's because I lack I don't have a partner, or I don't have the material conditions to become a father. So yeah. I would argue that in Spain there is a strong, also, or at least more. They would like to have more children than the one they have. And when do you ask women in Spain, when would be the ideal age to have your first baby? They always, if you average the responses, it's 27, which is what you see in Sweden, no? So I think that we can say that in Spain there is at least also strong intention to have babies.
No, I'm okay. I think the question is how to interpret the compositional effect of partnership. One way to think about if it's a truly exogenous, say, race or family origin, ethnicity, then it's a completely compositional. But in this case, I think you can think of this as a step to go through. It's a part of the process. So some people would not have a child because they don't have a partner. But on the other hand, even if they want to have a child, they don't necessarily find a partner, so they don't realize what I said yesterday, the Chinese, they don't realize intended fertility because they don't find a partner, they don't have resources, and for that reason. So to me, it's like education, it's a status attainment model. You will find a professional job, you need to get an education. So education, in some ways you can think of a composition, but also you think of that as an important step along the way of attaining status. So in that way, I think it's a step, it's an intermediate step rather than exogenous covariant like ethnicity and religion and family origin. So I do think it is something along the way to having a child rather than completely before the intention. That would be totally exogenous, totally compositional.
Yeah. So thanks for the sharing. Time is up. We need to wrap. So because we have another session, we should use the same room, but actually they are in different Zoom rooms. So if you try to follow up the next session, you need to just type another Zoom room, and that's all for today's third session, English session. And thank you all for participating in the session, and thanks for the speakers, and see you then in the next session.
Bye.
See you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.